also especially very honored to bring to the podium Professor Laura Enriquez, who has been working with Professor Ellner's research for a number of years and is a professor in the Department of Sociology. So if you can join me to welcome Laura Enriquez.
Thank you. I will be brief because actually you're all here to hear Professor Ellner, not me. But I do want to say a few things about him to situate him so that you know that you have these things in mind as the talk goes forward in thinking about the crisis in Venezuela today. To the extent that Venezuela is in the news these days, it is in ways that present images of chaos, violence, hardship, and government incompetence. The explicitly stated or implied suggestion is that the crisis of today is due to the actions or the inactions of the Maduro government and before that of the Chavez government. The implication is that if the Maduro government were removed from office through whatever means one might consider legitimate, all would be well. However, Professor Steve Ellner's work complicates that story. He comes at the puzzle of Venezuela's current crisis and of Venezuela more generally through several lenses that take us further than the news accounts. One of these lenses is historical. I suppose that should not be surprising given that he's a historian. In taking this approach to understanding Venezuelan society, his work shows us how some of the origins of the crisis go a long ways back in the country's history. Another lens he employs is comparative, in the sense of putting what is happening in Venezuela, and especially the process of change that has taken place there since the end of the last century, alongside the processes of social change elsewhere in Latin America. This is useful for helping us to see that the initial demand for change, which became apparent in elections starting in the late 1990s, stemmed from dynamics that went beyond Venezuela, specifically the deepening of inequality and poverty that occurred over the 1980s and 1990s as a result of neoliberal economic reforms that were implemented throughout the region. But it's also, this comparative lens is also helpful for identifying the similarities and differences in the strategies that have been adopted across the region for addressing those social ills. An additional lens that Professor Ellner's work employs is to look at specific issues from multiple positionalities within Venezuelan society. So in his writing on Chavismo, for example, he identifies the distinct sectors that provided critical support for it. These included parts of the organized working class and middle classes, and poorer, more marginalized populations that participate in the informal economy, informal sector of the economy, and the rural workforce. This kind of analysis is particularly helpful for thinking about the policy issues that the Venezuelan state has faced as these sectors of Venezuelan society, or as thinking sectorially, or thinking in terms of different positions within Venezuelan society, points out that different sectors have varying interests that they seek to advance through the political arena. And finally, Professor Ellner's work has also made notable theoretical contributions. Several areas of his work that I would like to just quickly underline in this sense are his work on the degree of class consciousness within the upper class in Venezuela, and for those who are interested in the pursuit of social change more generally, how a process of social transformation might proceed. So in all of these ways, Professor Ellner's work sheds new light on contemporary Venezuela. The body of his research offers multiple points of entry for understanding the crisis in Venezuela today. These multiple points of entry help to move us constructively beyond the black and white images presented in the media and by certain political actors. This complication of the story is important for engaging with the debates that are ongoing about we as individuals and as citizens of the US should or should not be doing with regard to that crisis. And let me just say 2 more words. Do you plan to say more in the way of introduction? I must say that Professor Ellner has been teaching at the Universidad de Oriente in Puerto La Cruz, Venezuela since 1977. And as has been mentioned, he has written or edited 13 volumes. Let me just mention 2 or 3 really quickly. The most recent is an edited volume entitled Latin America's Radical Left, Challenges and Complexities of Political Power in the 21st Century. Sole-authored book entitled Rethinking Venezuelan Politics, Class Conflict, and the Chavez Phenomenon. And earlier on, another edited volume, Venezuela, Hugo Chavez, and the Decline of an Exceptional Democracy. Let me welcome Professor Ellner.
Thank you for that introduction. I believe that one thing that stands out in Laura's presentation, and that is that if I have attempted to convey any message, one message, in all my writing on what's happening in Venezuela under the Chavez and Chavista governments, and if I attempt to convey any message in the talks that I'm giving on this tour that began at Boston University, the Latin American Center at Boston University about a month ago, and that message is that what is currently taking place in Venezuela and what has taken place since Chavez was elected president in 1998 is complex. And by saying that, and by saying that there are downsides and breakthroughs, the title of my forthcoming book, edited book, is just that. It's on the pink tide of Latin America, breakthroughs and shortcomings of Latin American politics in the 21st century. Just that, breakthroughs and shortcomings. And I think that that very message counters the arguments of the Trump administration, counters the narrative of the opposition in Venezuela, or at least the more radical opposition in Venezuela, and counters much of what the mainstream media is saying about Venezuela. And that is, the demonization of, as Laura said, the idea that if only Maduro would leave office, would be ousted, that things would be hunky-dory. And as a matter of fact, a number of Venezuelans who belong to the opposition, who are opposed to the government, in my opinion, tend to overlook or tend to forget about what was happening in Venezuela during an extended period of time prior to Chavez's election in 1998. And I think that there's a tendency on the part of many Venezuelans, perhaps across the political spectrum from left to right, to go back to the 1970s. I arrived in Venezuela in 1975, and it was a whole different Venezuela. It was a Venezuela during the boom period of the 1970s, prosperity that filtered down to the lower middle class and to the popular sectors of the population. And there's a tendency to ignore what Venezuela was like in the 1980s and the 1990s during a 20-year period when the price of oil declined a little bit, gradually after 1980, and then as the decade moved on, even more so, that led into the mass disturbances that took place in 1989 known as the Caracazo, which is really a misnomer because although it began in Caracas, it spread the same day throughout Venezuela and affected nearly all the cities of all sizes in Venezuela on February 27th, 1989. And then that led into the attempted coups in 1992 by Chavez in February and a second coup attempt in November 27th, 1992. So people who do that, people who compare Chavez and say, well, you know, in the good old days things weren't like they are today, fail to account for the fact that Chavez, they failed to account for what happened in 1998. They failed to account for the elections in November of 1998. Because in those elections, not only did an outsider win those elections, you could say that in a situation of discontent, outsiders, the opposition, you know, tends to win. People are discontent, they vote for change. But in this case, you know, they could have voted for AD because Rafael Caldera, who was associated with COPEI, the two main parties, COPEI and AD, Caldera, who had left COPEI but was associated with COPEI, he was a founder of COPEI, was president. So, you know, people just like here in the States, for so many years, you know, Democrats, Republican, and that was the case of Venezuela since 1958, over the modern democratic period. AD, with Betancourt and Leone, and then Caldera in 68, and then Carlos Andrés Perez in 73, who was AD, and then Herrera Campins, who was COPEI in 78, and in 83, another ADECO, Jaime Lucinchi. So they would have voted for AD, but they didn't. They voted for an outsider, and not only an outsider, but somebody who had spearheaded nothing less than a coup d'etat just a few years before that. So obviously there was discontent. And not only was there discontent, and not only did that express itself in the election of Chavez in 1998, but the only major candidate other than Chavez, who got, I think, 38% of the vote, Chavez got over 56%. So practically, you know, everybody was voting for these two candidates, and the other candidate was Enrique Salah Romer, who also had an anti-party discourse. He wasn't a member of COPEI or Acción Democrática. He had been associated with COPEI, but he was an independent, and his discourse was very anti-party. In fact, the results of the elections demonstrate just that, because Chavez had the most anti-party discourse, he was the most anti-establishment, and he won. Herrera Campins also had an anti-party discourse, and he got a very large vote. And Irene Sáenz, who was the front runner for the early part of the campaign that actually lasted almost 2 years, she had an anti-party discourse up until the time that she accepted the support of COPEI. When COPEI supported Irene Sáenz, her popularity, her approval rating nosedived. And so those were the candidates. And the other candidate was Alfaro Cero. Alfaro Cero, who had been Secretary General of Acción Democrática, who was the other major candidate, and the only candidate that was really identified with the political party system and the establishment, and he got about 1% of the vote. So it seems to me that to understand the context is very important. The context in which Venezuelans were not happy about the political party system, with very much discontent. And it seems to me that on the economic front, there was reason to be discontent. Because during the 1980s, but especially the 1990s, the Venezuelan economy went through a major transformation. The economy, which had been in which you had a Venezuelan capitalist class, and you had certain key industries that were, in some cases, state-run, and a model that emerged in the modern democratic period in 1958 of import substitution, of state intervention in the economy, which was more or less the position of AD, and to maybe a lesser extent Copé, but the position of the governments up until the 80s. That changed with neoliberalism. And in the age of neoliberalism, several things happened. First, the economy, you had massive privatization. And unlike what happened in Argentina, Chile, Brazil, Mexico, where the privatization meant that the national and multinational capital bought companies that were privatized. But you had a national capital that participated in an important way in that privatization wave. In Venezuela, just like in Peru, the privatization meant the transfer of strategic sectors of the economy to the multinationals, and national capital was left out in the cold. That was the case with the steel industry, which was the pride of Venezuelans. It was actually established under the dictatorship of Pérez Jiménez, but finished under the democratic government of Romo Betancourt after 1958, 1959. Sidor, the only steel company, was privatized by Caldera and was bought by an international consortium. The telephone company, which was also, a lot of people relate Pérez Jiménez with the right, but the fact of the matter is that he's kind of a confusing figure, and he bought the telephone company from the English, Cantaver. So telecommunications was run by the state until 1991. It was privatized and bought by GTT, and GTT was bought by Verizon. So Verizon owned telecommunications in Venezuela. The Electricidad de Caracas was bought by a U.S. corporation in the 1990s. And in the private sector, you had a number of companies that were emblematic of Venezuelan capitalism. For instance, cement, Vencemos, which was owned by Eugenio Mendoza, who was the Rockefeller of Venezuela going back to the 40s, the early 40s, during World War II, when you had what's known as spontaneous import substitution. During the war, national capital began to produce what the country previously had imported. So that was a product of national capital. And Mendoza died in the late 80s, and his company was bought out by the Japanese and eventually Cemex of Mexico. The Bank of Venezuela, which was the oldest bank in Venezuela, was bought out by Banco Santander. The Banco Provincial, which might have been the biggest bank, was bought out by another Spanish bank, Bilbao Vizcaya. And Savoy, which was and is a company of great national pride, chocolate, Venezuelan chocolate, perhaps the best in the world. That was bought out by Nestle. So you had entire sectors. Some people say that the Venezuelan economy in the 1990s ceased to be Venezuelan. So a nationalist figure like Chavez comes along and talks about, nationalism, national pride, talks about the economy, and the fact that, the economy is not really functioning in accordance with the interests of the nation, and you don't have, development because the economy is foreign controlled. So this explains, I believe, it may be that a lot of people are not in agreement with me, because, people usually think, well, something as abstract as, privatization doesn't affect people directly, immediately. But I believe it was. I believe it was part of Chavez's image, that people assimilated. Maybe they didn't talk about it, but they were aware of the fact that, I remember the first time, for instance, I saw in the early 90s companies like Mobil, ExxonMobil, BP, and a number of other companies. The oil was semi-nationalized in 1976. And then in the 1990s, through the privatization, the gradual privatization of the oil industry, these companies came back. And I remember, all the gasoline stations were state-run, just like in Mexico. And then all of a sudden, you started seeing, BP, Mobil, and a number of other U.S., European companies. And it affected people. And when Chavez came along and had a nationalistic narrative, a nationalistic discourse, that influenced people and influenced their voting behavior. And the second, so let me just say, to bring that up to date, Chavez, at first, Chavez at first emphasized social programs. His priority was the poor people, and he said it. He said, I'm the president of all Venezuelans, but my priority is the poor, because they need me the most. A lot of people in the middle class didn't like that statement, because no other important Venezuelan political figure said that. So the social programs, maybe for political reasons, were emphasized over the economic development. That might have been somewhat of a mistake. But it was politically necessary, because when Chavez was overthrown in 2002 and the poor came down from the hills, that might not have happened had Chavez been more oriented around economic development and less priority, less emphasis on the social programs. But by 2006, Chavez was re-elected president. It was actually the third presidential election. Chavez won in 98, 2000, and in 2006, and then he won in 2012. So he was elected president 4 times. In 2006, he won with the highest percentage of any president in modern Venezuelan history, going back to 1958. Jaime Lucinchi got a very high percentage of votes, but Chavez got 63% of the vote in 2006. And he did what I consider to be very astute. He took advantage of his position of strength. He had just clobbered the opposition. The opposition candidate got less than 40% of the vote. He took advantage of that by deepening the process of change. And what he did was he nationalized these same industries that had been privatized in the 1990s. Some people say that wasn't so ambitious, that wasn't so radical. There's some people on the left who say that Chavez was really not a leftist or what have you. But the fact of the matter is, because the argument is that these same companies had been state-run prior to the neoliberal period. But the fact is that the nationalization of these industries was a banner that dated back in time, because most of the political parties, though not all of them, favored state control of the strategic sectors of the economy. That was AD's banner, even before it was AD. It was the PDN in the 1930s. And that was their position, that the strategic sectors of the economy should be run by the state. And in the 1961 Constitution, approved of by AD and COPE and URD, which were the 3 main parties, along with the Communist Party, they all supported the Constitution, which stated just that basic industry, that's the term that they used, strategic sectors, basic industry, more or less the same, or similar, should be state-controlled. Socialism, that was far-reaching. Perhaps it wouldn't have been so far-reaching in the 60s or 70s. But in the 21st century, in the age of globalization, when the discourse of the neoliberals that the private sector should run the economy and the state should pull out of the economy, what Chavez did in 2007, 2008 was quite far-reaching. He nationalized electricity. He nationalized the cement industry, which I said before had been sold off to the Japanese and then the Mexicans. Vencemos, which is the big state company in Venezuela, was nationalized. Cantaver, the telecommunications, which was owned by Verizon, was nationalized. The Bank of Venezuela was also taken over from Banco Santander from Spain. And the oil industry, which was being privatized, which in the 1990s, something similar to Mexico. You know, Andrés Manuel López Obrador was just elected president of Mexico, and one of his banners has been, you know, no more privatization of the oil industry. It was being gradually privatized, because to have privatized the oil industry in Mexico would have gone against the Mexican Revolution, the nationalization of oil in 1938, which was such an important development in Mexican history. So they did it gradually, and that's what they were doing in Venezuela, through what was known as the Apertura Petrolera, the oil opening in the 1990s. Well, Chavez renationalized, or the Chavistas would say, and Chavez said, he nationalized. He would say that the oil industry was had never been nationalized. So he gained greater state control of the oil industry. And one of the things that he established in 2007 was that all the mixed companies that had been dominated by private capital, all the mixed companies involved in the primary exploitation of oil, had to be 60% state-owned. So that's what Chavez did, and that was, you know, very far-reaching for the time. The other point that I want to emphasize, you know, I was referring to the 1990s and then referring to Chavez to try to give you a feel for why Chavez was elected and why Chavez and the Chavistas have maintained the support that they have. And let me say that this statement goes against what a lot of people will say, that Maduro is very unpopular. But the fact of the matter is, when you consider that the Chavistas have been in power for almost 20 years, when has that happened? You know, throughout Latin America and the United States. You know, here in the United States, Roosevelt was elected president 4 times, but he died in office. So he was president for approximately 12 or 13 years. Chavez was elected president in 1998. And by the year 2000, people were saying it's all over for Chavez. There's no way that Chavez will maintain his popularity. He's going to be out of there. A lot of people said that. There's one outstanding scholar, whose name I'm not going to mention because he's a friend of mine. But he wrote an article in Foreign Affairs with a lot of statistics, a lot of empirical information. And the whole thing was to demonstrate that in terms of economic, what was happening in the economy, what was happening with regard to public opinion, that Chavez's days as president were numbered. That's what he said in early 2000. And I was at a conference with him at Duke University. And I said to him, he was there, I said, you know, what you said, and this was like in maybe 2003, and I said, you know, what you should be analyzing is not why Chavez is going to be out of power, is not going to be able to retain power. You should write an article on how is it that Chavez, with the opposition of the elite, the church hierarchy, the entire communications media, all of it, without exception, the entire private communications media, you wouldn't get one article, you wouldn't get one statement on TV, other than the state channel, that was even balanced. It was all anti-Chavez, with the entire opposition of the established labor movement that had already been discredited, but the labor movement leadership, the political parties, the traditional political parties, the United States, and most important of all, the Chamber of Commerce of Venezuela, which had attempted to overthrow Chavez twice. The coup in 2002, April 2002, and December of 2002, January 2003. So I said to him, how do you explain that with all this opposition, Chavez has maintained himself in power for all of 4 years? That was back in about 2003. I don't remember the exact year. Well, now, 20 years have gone by. And there's a lot of opposition and there's a lot of discontent in Venezuela. But how do we explain? I mean, the real question is not how is it that the Chavistas have messed things up. The question is, how is it that Maduro, with all the economic difficulties that he has, for reasons that I can get into, if I have time, I'll get into, how is it that he has the support that he has? And so I attempted to partly answer that question by making reference to the social programs, by making reference to the economic nationalism. And I just wanted to mention one additional factor. And that is something that's hard for us in the United States to appreciate its importance. But I realized I went to Venezuela to do research for my PhD dissertation on organized labor, and I realized immediately that this term, which I didn't even know how to translate at first, was really essential. In Spanish it's called prestaciones sociales, and it means severance payment, basically. And that's extremely important for Venezuelans. And that system of severance payment, in which a worker gets severance payment on the basis of his or her last salary multiplied by the number of years that they have been working for that company. That was the system that Caldera, whose name I mentioned several times, 20 years old, in 1936, the beginning of the modern period in Venezuelan history, the death of the dictator Juan Vicente Gomez, in 1936, Caldera, 20 years old, established that system. You get paid on the basis of your last salary. That system, Caldera is president in 1997, in June of 1997, he eliminated. He eliminated his own baby. And that elimination of the severance payment system as it existed was extremely unpopular among the workers. So much so that you had a real divide. It was obvious for anybody who was doing any kind of research into organized labor that there was a real divide between the leadership of organized labor that supported that for political reasons and the workers themselves. So Chavez, who was running for president at the time, beginning his campaign, supported the workers. And that old system that was so popular, that you got severance payment on the basis of your last salary, was reestablished by Chavez in the new labor law. It's called the Ley Orgánica de Trabajadores y Trabajadoras, LOTT, that was passed in 2012. So this is just to give you an idea of, how it is that Chavez was able to maintain his popularity leading up to the elections that he won shortly before he went off to Cuba for the last time for medical treatment, and then he returned to Venezuela but died shortly after that in March of 2013. So he was elected president 4 times, and the last time was in 2012. Okay, one of the the purpose of this tour of mine is to talk about the sanctions, and so I'd like to make some references to the sanctions, but I think that what I've said up until now is really the best argument against the sanctions. And that is that if you argue that Maduro is a dictator, if you argue that Maduro is responsible for all the economic problems, and you have this feeling that Maduro is like, this unpopular figure and Chavez before him as well, then the argument in favor of the sanctions, the justification of the sanctions, may seem plausible. But if you realize that the Chavistas, Chavez implemented policies that were popular, and Maduro has retained those policies, he hasn't turned to neoliberalism, he hasn't re-implemented the policies of the 1990s, whereas the opposition stands for that. The opposition, both the moderates and the radicals, are neoliberal. Then you'd say, well, maybe it's more complex. And if it's more complex, then sanctions are not justified. In other words, you can say that things aren't black and white. You can say that Maduro has made some mistakes. That's what I say. And Laura, who's apparently read a lot of my work, can second me on that. I'm critical of a lot of things. But if you're critical, but also recognize the positive aspects of the Chavez government and there are aspects that Maduro has maintained, then the sanctions are not justified. You only can justify sanctions if you're talking about somebody who is illegitimate, somebody who has really messed things up in a big way. And furthermore, you can really only talk about sanctions when you're talking about a government that is not democratic. And what the Trump administration does, and those like the opposition, or at least the radical opposition, that is campaigning in favor of the sanctions, I mean, there are groups that support the opposition in Canada, I don't know about here in the United States, which are lobbying in favor of these sanctions. And what the narrative of the Trump administration and those who support the sanctions, others who support the sanctions, is to talk about the economic crisis. They use the term humanitarian crisis, which, is somewhat exaggerated, but basically true. Basically, the economic situation is very difficult in Venezuela. And they conflate that message, or that affirmation, with the fact that Venezuela is a dictatorship, the violation of human rights, the violation of democratic norms. But that is highly misleading, in my opinion. And they do it in such a way that the listener who knows something about Venezuela and knows full well that the economic situation is very difficult, when the topic of violation of human rights gets slipped in there and then slipped out, the person, if they're not very analytical, said, well, if what they're saying about the economic crisis is true, probably what he or she is saying about the violation of human rights is also true. Why don't they take it separately? In my opinion, that's what you have to do. You've got economics and you've got democracy, and they're two separate topics. And if you just justify sanctions and possible military intervention, which Trump is now supporting as a possibility, you can't justify that on the basis of economic difficulty. Because if that was your criterion, you would be, proposing intervention and sanctions against a number of governments, a number of countries in Africa, throughout Latin America, where the economic situation is as bad or worse than Venezuela. So that's not enough. They have to bring in the message of democracy. And I would argue that that's more complex. And it's complex because you have a problem of communication. Because there are terms and there are concepts that we define in a very different manner here in the United States. Take take the term, I'll just give you one example, I'm going to give you several examples, but I'll just begin with this. The term liberal democracy, as opposed to Rousseau democracy, direct democracy, and decision-making. Our definition of democracy is liberal democracy, and that's fine. But I don't think we should be that, ethnocentric or narrow-minded to not consider that there are other models of democracy that are also legitimate. And I'll give you an example. This is just an anecdote, but I think it's interesting. When Chavez ran for president in 2006, the slogan was, "We're going to get 10 million votes." That was a banner. 10 million votes. 10 million votes would have meant, in terms of the number of people who did vote, that would have represented 80% of the voters. And the Chavistas, I heard them say, because I felt that that was a mistake. That shouldn't be a priority. I felt that there was a problem of corruption. There is a problem of corruption. It's not easy to move against corruption, especially when you've got so many powerful enemies. Corruption is not what people think, that you just have to decree, jail this guy and jail this guy. It's much more complicated. I won't get into this unless somebody wants to ask a question about it. But in any case, I was told by the Chavistas, we're doing that because we want to demonstrate to the United States that Chavez is democratic, that these elections, the United States under the Bush administration in 2006 was saying that the elections were fraudulent, that Chavez was a dictator and all that. So the Chavistas were saying, we're trying to demonstrate to the United States that, and what better way to prove it than to get such a high percentage of vote so that nobody can say this is a dictatorship. He said, it's because you don't understand the United States. Because in the United States, the concept of liberal democracy is based on the right of minorities, based on checks and balances. So you've got to have a party that's in power, but you've got to have another party that is also fairly influential, can place a check on the party that's in power. That's our motto. And all the political scientists, or most of them in the United States, advocate or defend that motto. So that if Chavez were to get 80% of the vote, which he didn't get, but if he were to get 80% of the vote, that would be very democratic according to the Rousseau-type model, because that's what Rousseau advocated, but not the liberal democratic model. So you have a clash of models. So that's one reason why it's complex. But there's another that has a lot to do with what's happened recently in Venezuela. And that is that the protests of the opposition in 2014 and 2017 lasted 4 months and were terrible developments because there were a number of deaths. In 2014 there were 36 deaths, and in 2017 there were over 130. Many of those deaths were people who were demonstrating, many were people who weren't demonstrating, some of them were Chavistas. There were 6 National Guardsmen who were killed in 2014, and there were one or two policemen who were killed. The opposition called these protests civil disobedience. And they affirmed that they had a right to take to the streets and take over the streets. The New York Times published an article that built on this argument. It was actually a Sunday magazine article. It wasn't a short, it was a magazine article, the Sunday Times. And the author compared Leopoldo Lopez, who led the protests in 2014, and coined the slogan, Salida Ya, regime change now. Then he dropped the ya, but regime change, and stated publicly, we're going to continue to protest until Maduro is removed from office, until Maduro leaves office, we're going to stay on the streets. We're going to continue this. And people were getting killed day after day, and he was saying that. So he gets compared to Martin Luther King. Well, Martin Luther King, firstly, you know, his people weren't killing policemen, they weren't killing National Guardsmen. And secondly, his protests were not taking place over a period of 4 months. And thirdly, these protests, in some cases, just a handful of people. In fact, most of the concentrations were between 3 and 10 or 15 people. In other places, there were a lot more. I'm not saying it was an isolated kind of thing, but they were closing down main intersections, main drags, connecting municipalities for a 4-month period. I mean, there are people who couldn't really get out of their homes, practically, virtually, during that 4-month period. Martin Luther King wasn't doing that. So there's a difference in paradigm. I got criticized by somebody who probably, I don't know the person, I remember my Facebook, I don't even remember who the person was, but apparently the person was somebody who had experienced protesting here in the States, and said, you know, you're criticizing the opposition for protesting and for civil disobedience, but what's wrong with that? And I realized that you have to define yourself. The devil is in the detail. Civil disobedience in the States is a whole different story in most cases. So it's a question of paradigm, and that's hard for people in the United States. These protests were protests based. They built barricades, fire, and in 2017, more than 2014, the protesters were dressed in military garb with gloves, and you know, they were attacking the police, the security people. And I'll give you another example of how these paradigms are so tricky. In 2017, Enrique Capriles, who's another leading member of the opposition, stated day after day, our protest is going to go to downtown Caracas. We have a right to reach downtown Caracas. We want to bring our message to the Attorney General, to the National Congress, to the Presidential Palace, etc., etc. And we have a right to do that. And, you know, somebody in the States who heard that message would say, yeah, he does have a right, and the government shouldn't prohibit that. But the context is key. In 2002, the coup took place precisely based on that playbook scenario. The protest, in that case a very massive protest of hundreds of thousands of people in the eastern part of Caracas, and then all of a sudden the leader stood up and said, we're going to downtown Caracas. And it was a mess. It was a mess. If anybody saw the documentary, The Revolution Will Not Be Televised, you'll have an idea of what happened that day. But that led into the coup. And the Chavez government, and the Maduro government, had every reason, in my opinion, to take that position. Because, at least for me, it was obvious that even if it was a relatively small group, much smaller than in 2002, even if there were, you know, say 20, 30,000 protesters who reached downtown Caracas, they would have stayed there. And then their people would have come in from all over the country. And so you would have had 200,000, 300,000, 500,000 people surrounding the presidential palace with CNN, which is anti-Trump, but even more so anti-Maduro. I mean, the media is not even-handed when it comes to Venezuela, not at all. And so they would have been there. Any incident trying to contain this crowd would have, you know, made, you know, banner headlines throughout the world. And so the government decided not to allow for that. So day after day, Lopez was saying, we're going to the downtown area. Day after day, you had clashes between the protesters and security forces, and day after day, you had deaths and people who were wounded. So again, it's a question of paradigm, and it's a question of context. You've got to appreciate the context to really know what's going on. I'm aware of the fact that there's a time factor. Let's see, do you have any recommendation in terms of
Maybe if you want to talk a little more about the sanctions for
the sanctions?
5 minutes or so, and then we could open it up for some more discussion.
Gladly. Gladly.
Mhm.
So the argument behind the sanctions is that this is a dictatorship, and that we need, international solidarity with Venezuela. But solidarity in the opposite sense of the solidarity that I'm supporting on this tour. The economic sanctions affects the Venezuelan economy in many different ways, and I'm not going to go into detail, but just to say that it prohibits Citgo, the Venezuelan oil company, from remitting profits back to Venezuela. And it's been estimated that as a result, the Venezuelan government has been deprived of $1 billion since these sanctions first went into effect a little over a year ago. It also prohibits U.S. financial institutions from purchasing bonds from the Venezuelan government, making it very difficult for Venezuela in a difficult economic situation from refinancing the public debt, something which any government would do in a situation of economic difficulty. The Venezuelan government is having a hard time doing that. And in addition, the sanctions themselves affect Venezuela's credit ranking, which means that any bonds that it sells to any country is going to have a lower ranking. It means that they have to pay, well, they get less dividends. They have to pay more dividends, excuse me, for those bonds. I mean, that's how the credit ranking system works. And the Obama decree in 2015 that declared Venezuela a threat to U.S. national security also affected Venezuela's credit ranking. So that these sanctions have had a number of adverse effects. Venezuelan funds have been frozen in financial institutions in Europe. For instance, there's this one case of $1.6 billion that was frozen in a clearinghouse in Belgium that was allocated for the purpose of purchasing medicine and food. And so it's had a direct effect, a major impact on the Venezuelan economy. And it's also affected investments. And I think that this impact is as important as the direct economic impact. And this isn't something that's getting mentioned. I don't hear the Chavista people talking about this, and I don't hear the media talking about this, not even media that is sympathetic to the Maduro government. When the president of your country says that Venezuela represents a threat to the national security of your country, you're going to think twice about investing in Venezuela. When Obama declared Venezuela a threat to U.S. national security, and now with Trump going even further, playing an activist role throughout Latin America, Tillerson, Mattis, Haley, Pence, traveling, throughout the hemisphere, calling on Latin American countries to join the campaign against Venezuela, something that they've already done, but with a harder line than the position of these right-wing conservative governments. That's going to affect investments for two reasons. Firstly, these companies aren't sympathetic to a government that calls itself socialist, but also for economic reasons. You figure, well, if there's this campaign against Venezuela, Venezuela is going to represent more of a risk from an economic viewpoint, not a political viewpoint only, but from an economic viewpoint. So important companies have pulled out of Venezuela. Ford, General Motors, Clorox, Kimberly-Clark, and oil service companies that have had contracts and are in Venezuela, such as Halliburton, and other big service companies have decided to work through smaller companies. They're not working directly in the oil industry. They're subcontracting their contracts. So that means less money for PDVSA, less money for the Venezuelan oil company. So there's been a number of important effects. And let me just end by mentioning one last effect of these sanctions and the Trump administration's aggressive discourse towards Venezuela. And that is that it promotes polarization. It promotes polarization in the region, and it promotes polarization in Venezuela. We see now, with the election on Sunday of Bolsonaro, that as right-wing as some of these countries are, Piñera, my God, Piñera was elected in Chile with the two main parties that supported him were parties that were Pinochet parties. They supported Pinochet in the referendum and the election in Chile. One was more identified with Pinochet than the other, but they were both pro-Pinochet parties. And Macri in Argentina, etc., Duque in Colombia. But these countries at least have stated that they oppose military intervention in Venezuela. Now with Bolsonaro, with his son calling for military action against Venezuela, and he himself saying he's going to break diplomatic relations with Venezuela. So, you know, there are degrees, there are gradations, and this just radicalizes the region. And it radicalizes the situation in Venezuela. The radicals in the opposition who oppose dialogue with Maduro feel strengthened, they feel empowered, and it pulls the rug out from under the moderates in the opposition that favor dialogue, favor participation in election. There are several parties that are participating in the elections in December, the municipal elections. COPEI, which I've mentioned before, is a long-standing important political party. It's not as big as it was in the past. But COPEI and MAS, Movimiento Socialismo, which is not a leftist party, they're participating in elections in December. So that Trump's actions and discourse polarizes the opposition. And let me just end by saying, with regard to solidarity, I believe that there are solid arguments against the sanctions without saying anything about Venezuela. Sanctions have not worked historically. They didn't work in Iran, they didn't work in Iraq, they haven't worked anyplace. And it affects people across the political spectrum. It doesn't affect only those people who support those governments. And in addition to that, they're illegal. The United Nations, the OAS, declare unilateral sanctions illegal by international law. But in addition to that, I believe that it's important to appreciate the complexity of what's happening in Venezuela and appreciate that there are positive aspects that should be, investigated, that should be researched, that people should, become familiar, not experts, but know something about Venezuela. In order to answer that question that I posed from the beginning, how do you explain that the Chavistas have maintained power for such a long period of time? And the answer to that question, I think, is very instrumental in combating the arguments of those who favor sanctions, saying that everything in Venezuela is bad and that Chavez and Maduro have done everything wrong. Thank you.
So I do want to help facilitate some questions that will be here, but on behalf of the speakers, they really are open to direct questions. So if you would like to pose questions for Steve, for Professor Ellner right now, that you can do so. So any thoughts, questions that you might like to ask? Yes.
I'm Chinese, well, I was born in Hong Kong, but I live in Venezuela in, I think, late 80s or so. So one of the questions I guess that came to mind, I had a lot of questions actually. The US is not investing in Venezuela, but I mean China, which quote unquote supposed to be communist, and Russia are those countries investing in Venezuela perhaps?
Yes, yes. As a matter of fact, Venezuela has increased its export of oil. You know, the Venezuelan economy is dependent on oil. And currently it exports 600,000 barrels a day, which is a lot. Constitutes, I don't know what percentage, perhaps 25% of its exports. And Maduro was just in China just recently, and he stated that the goal is to increase that to 1 million barrels per day. And the Chinese have this Belt and Road Initiative, has investments in infrastructure, which the private, you know, investments by multilateral financial institutions and the private sector tend to neglect. So those investments are important. Both Russia and China have investments in the Faja de Orinoco, which is the oil belt region, which is heavyweight, non-conventional oil. And Chevron, which was a big investor in oil, has, you know, right around the time of the Obama decree, has ceased to make major investments in Venezuela. So in a sense, Russia and China are filling the gap.
Yes.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for showing the reality that is in Venezuela, and it's very important. I really am grateful for the solidarity of this extension, because it is really hard for Venezuelan people to survive, you know, in the daily. And two things that I wanted to ask. I wanted to ask about the geopolitics of Guyana, Colombia, and now Brazil, of course. And thank you for saying that Venezuela is giving electricity practically free when we are really in bad shape. We are giving electricity free to Brazil, and they just said that they cannot pay because the United States imposed sanctions, which is really bad.
Right.
Now, the other question is about the geopolitics with the narco traffic of Colombia. You know, how this, you know, the 7 military bases of United States around the border affect this sanctioning. How, if you know, and if you can say how Colombia have managed to be first actor in this sanctions by the coordinating the exchange of the dollar for bolivars, right, and left the country without currency, right, practically.
Right. Okay. Yeah, I would just say that with regard to the border situation, that that is being used in order to justify military buildup. The governor of Roraima, the state of Roraima, called on the Temer government to send troops to the border because of the massive number of Venezuelan immigrants. And Temer, I think at first he hesitated, but eventually he said yes. So you have a buildup on the Brazilian border, and certainly on the Colombian border. Vice President Pence claimed that Venezuela is threatening Colombia. Colombia is our ally, is our friend.
It's member of the TAN.
What's that?
It's a member of NATO.
And it's a member, right? It's a member of NATO now, right? So that you know, it's such a contradiction because the Trump administration, you know, talks about democracy and claims that Venezuela is a dictatorship, and at the same time, Trump goes to the United Nations and says we distinguish between our friends and and those who are not our friends. So you've really got to be on our good side to get U.S. aid. I mean, he's conditioning aid to being our friend. And yet, the examples that he used are countries that are hardly democratic. He mentioned Poland, the Duda government that's the European Union is in the process of considering censoring, and he mentioned Saudi Arabia. Well, that was before this recent incident with Saudi Arabia, but we all know that Saudi Arabia is anything in the world that you want other than a democracy, and the same thing with the United Arab Emirates. So that these are our friends. And Pence, made reference to the fact that Colombia is being threatened by Venezuela. When there's a military buildup on both sides, it's hard to really know, because one side crosses the border. I mean, we know that. I mean, this is a worldwide historical phenomenon. One side crosses the border and the other. So just a military buildup. If the Colombia sends troops to the border, if Brazil sends troops to the border, Venezuela has to do the same. It's going to do the same. It means a drain economically for Venezuela, as it does for those countries as well. Any incident that takes place could result in a military confrontation between the two countries. So that's with regard to Colombia and Brazil. With regard to the currency problem, yes, there is a shortage of currency. Transactions in Venezuela are taking place in digital form, through transfer, bank transfer, through credit card, debit cards. But a lot of people don't have credit cards. A lot of people don't have debit cards. And so it's a very difficult situation for Venezuela. And the Venezuelan government, states, I don't really know the details, so I can't really, form an opinion, but that Colombia has encouraged through the exchange rate these transactions. But I think that it has a lot to do also with the shortage of currency has a lot to do with the illegal mining, gold mining, diamond mining in the Guayana region, because those transactions are illegal and they can't take place through credit cards or in digital form. It's got to be in cash. So there's a drain there's a drain on the Colombian border, and it means that cash is hard to get. And like I said, even if you have a credit card and a debit card, there are a lot of merchants, some doctors, for instance, who don't have their machines, so you can't use a credit card, and insist on payment in cash. So it just aggravates the situation for Venezuelans.
I want to, back here, back row.
Thank you. Hi, my name's Roberto. I'm a journalist. I was there during the upheavals of 2014 after I saw Jared Leto make grand pronouncements about this guy, Leopoldo Lopez, who I wanted to look into. On the Academy Awards, no less, after Kevin Spacey, Madonna, Cher were just promoting him. So I went down and I investigated for Foreign Policy magazine. Did a 6,000-word piece, and I ended up documenting the way that Lopez is part of a pretty vast network of what would, in this context, be certifiably terrorist, fascist, extremist, militant organizations that are heavily funded by interests in Colombia, within Venezuela itself, and obviously with U.S. support, as was confirmed to me, for example, by a former head of the CIA in Latin America. So, I've lost track because I've gone on to some other project, but I'm wondering, what would you say the effects of the more naked scent of the extremist fascistic element in Brazil? What will that effect on those networks of fascists that I saw and even had the pleasure of having their gun put in my chest?
Yeah, by the way, are you aware of Leopoldo Lopez's family background?
I interviewed his parents, yes.
Well, the Rockefeller of Venezuela was, for many decades, I mentioned the cement industry when I talked about the privatization. The cement industry goes back to the early 40s. And the owner of that company that I also mentioned, Vencemos, was Eugenio Mendoza. Eugenio Mendoza was the Rockefeller of Venezuela. And he had 4 or 5 brothers, but his only brother that was a partner of his and became minister was Eduardo Goytecoa. Goytecoa. Eduardo Mendoza Goytecoa was Eugenio Mendoza's brother. I'm not referring to the student leader. He was Minister of Agriculture in the 45 to 48 period under the AD government, 45 to, I think he left in 47. Well, that was Leopoldo Lopez's grandfather.
Yeah.
So Leopoldo Lopez comes from, you know, one of the wealthiest families. This detail is not transmitted, and I think it's interesting because it's part of a trend throughout Latin America in which the political class, the traditional political class in Latin America has been discredited. And so you have business people, and not just any business people, but people from the elite, from big economic interests, being voted into office. Macri is an example of that. The candidate for president in Ecuador is another example of that. And in the case of Venezuela, Maria Corina Machado, who is one of the most important opposition leaders, and one of the most, I would say the most radical. I would say she is even more than Lopez.
Yeah.
Because her party, which is a very, relatively small party, but she's important as a political figure. She's the one that was photographed next to President Bush and had a 40-minute interview. You know, any Latin American head of state talks to a U.S. president, and he or she gets maybe 20 minutes. Maria Corina Machado got 40 minutes, and there was a famous photo of her next to Bush. Well, she is, you remember I mentioned, when I talked about privatization, and I mentioned electricity, I mentioned Electricidad de Caracas. Well, that's her family, the family of Zuluaga Machado. So that, and then the other person I mentioned, Capriles. I mentioned him in my presentation. Well, Capriles is also from the economic elite of Venezuela. So that, I think that's an important detail to mention. Yeah, I think that, to answer your question, I think that that is definitely going to have an impact. Because as I said before, you know, Maduro, you know, when people say Maduro isn't Chavez, there's no question about it. Maduro doesn't have the charisma that Chavez had. I don't think he has the political acumen that Chavez has. But you also have to factor into the equation that Maduro faces a much more challenging situation. Economically, because under Chavez, the price of oil shot way up and stayed there until he died in 2014. Maduro's first year as president. In August of 2014, the price of oil started declining, and then it nosedived. And the situation geopolitically. Venezuela is surrounded by hostile countries, and now with the election in Brazil, that situation goes from bad to worse.
Over here.
Yeah, I'm curious. First of all, thank you for the information. I'm a Cal alum, and it's hard to get information about Venezuela kind of in this kind of perspective. And I work in Peru, and I'm curious kind of the impact, you know, your thoughts about there's over 600,000 estimated to come from Venezuela to Peru, and the border is going to close in December for kind of sanctuary status, and now they're closing in October. Today is the last day they're actually closing. So I'm just curious, that with that kind of situation, that mass kind of movement in South America, there's also, being in Peru, there's a lot of notice about individuals actually going back to Venezuela. There's even actually resources to fly people back to come back home. And offering jobs, which is kind of different than other kind of migration in Latin America. I'm just curious about your thoughts about that.
Yeah, there is, you know, undoubtedly massive immigration of Venezuelans because the situation is so difficult in Venezuela. Hyperinflation and purchasing power. That situation has been exaggerated in terms of the number of immigrants. The United Nations report of the United Nations documented 2.6, correct me if I'm wrong, 2.6 million immigrants over the recent past, when this massive immigration began. And there are 5 million Colombians in Venezuela. So, you know, that should not be politicized. The Venezuelan immigration should not be politicized. And this is a concrete example of that. And, you know, when you consider that the presence of immigrants, massive number of immigrants in Colombia, in Peru, in Ecuador, and some other countries, is being used in order to demonstrate that there's a humanitarian crisis, and that the United States has to, you know, it's being used by the United States. It says that Colombia is being threatened by this situation of immigration. And so the United States, you know, is now providing aid to the immigrants who are in Colombia. But that is politicized. What about the caravan? And you contrast that with the caravan, the famous caravan that's heading towards the United States. I mean, it's so contradictory that President Trump would say, there are mean people. I mean, those are his words. There are mean people who are on that caravan. And yet, does he say that about Venezuela? I don't believe any of those people are mean. The Venezuelan immigrants aren't mean, and the people in the caravan aren't mean, obviously. But, you know, he uses that language for the caravan, and when he talks about the immigrants, he's got a whole different narrative. So that is contradictory. And with regard to what you said, yes, I mean, it's interesting that the Maduro government has made an effort, has provided these people with free transportation back to Venezuela. It's very difficult. I mean, you know, being an immigrant in another country is difficult in the best of circumstances, and in this situation it's even worse because there's a certain amount of hostility. The Venezuelans feel a degree of resentment that these immigrants, and I'm talking about Venezuelans in general, this doesn't have anything to do with whether you're Chavistas or anti-Chavista. Venezuela has always been very generous in terms of immigration. Venezuelans themselves in the past didn't emigrate, but they did have, you know, an open door policy practically towards immigrants. I remember when I arrived in 1975 as a student in the United States doing research for my thesis, and I lived in a boarding house, and these were immigrants from immigrants, immigrants. They were young people, immigrants, from all over Latin America. I remember Argentina, Chile, all the countries of Latin America. And some of them were political immigrants. I remember somebody from the Communist Party of Bolivia who was living in the boarding house. And I remember from other countries too, from Chile, an architect from Chile. These were people who were being politically persecuted, and they arrived in Venezuela. So Venezuelans say, you know, other countries should respond in kind. They should appreciate the history of Venezuela of welcoming, you know, immigrants from throughout the continent, especially Colombia, where there's a very large Colombian population.
But also European people.
Excuse-
People from Europe.
Definitely, definitely.
All over. Yeah.
A question back here?
Yes.
So, I was just wondering, like, what would it take to have the sanctions lifted?
Well, that's a very good question. It's a very good question, because the Democratic Party, I think there is an indication that the Democratic Party is considering the possibility of taking up the issue, not of the sanctions, but the military threats against Venezuela. And I say this because the New York Times, which, you know, is not organically linked to the Democratic Party, but, you know, ideologically there's an overlap there. It tends to be pro-Democrat. They supported Hillary Clinton in the last elections. The New York Times published an article critical of Trump's meeting with military rebels. We don't know whether they were active members of the military or retired members of the military but that he met with him 3 times. And the article stated if it was once, you could understand that, you know, Trump is collecting information, and that's legitimate. But 3 times, obviously, there's an element of support and interest. And the fact that Trump himself stated that a military coup in Venezuela would be successful, that in effect is saying, I mean implicitly, but almost explicitly, that the United States would welcome a military coup. So that the New York Times would oppose that, I think is interesting because I surmise that after these upcoming elections in November, that, you know, projecting towards the presidential elections of 2020, that the Democratic Party may consider the possibility of taking up the issue of the possibility of military intervention in Venezuela. That doesn't go far enough. And some NGOs, which are centrist politically, they're not on the left, they're not on the right, they're kind of like centrist, also oppose military intervention but favor economic sanctions. So I don't consider that position at all positive. But I think that it's very positive that the issue gets raised. And that would be an important first step. If politicians, particularly politicians in the progressive wing of the Democratic Party, were to raise that issue. Because after all, Bernie Sanders, to name just one example, on the debates, I remember he made reference to Libya and said it was a pragmatic argument. It wasn't on ethical grounds. It was pragmatically. You know, what we did in Libya was a mistake because Libya is a failed state. You have terrorist groups now operating out of Libya, and drug trade and everything, and then the immigration and everything. It's been a failure. So it seems to me that if the progressive wing of the Democratic Party or others who don't belong to the progressive wing were to just raise the issue, it would be a step forward.
Over here.
A long time. So I have 2 kind of interconnected questions. So if you could speak a little bit about the recent economic reforms that Maduro put forward and whether there's any sort of hope that those might forestall some of the incredible inflation that's happening right now. And secondly, you know, the question of corruption, which you brought up earlier, which I think is a really tricky topic and always has been. And, you know, we can only really speculate on some level about the impact that that's having economically. And during better times, there was a lot of discussion among sort of the grassroots Chavistas about sort of the internal right wing that was kind of messing things up, and sort of a lot of critique of people like Diosdado Cabello and those types of people who were perceived as being participating in sort of corruption. And so there's this idea that maybe Maduro hasn't been able to keep that in check in the same way that Chavez says. At least that's one of the kind of things that I've heard. And I'm just curious as to kind of what your thoughts or what you're hearing from sort of the grassroots Chavistas or people about the kind of discourse around corruption at this point.
Okay, just very briefly, because there are several components to your questions. One is the recent measures that the Maduro government has taken on the economic front, I think is encouraging, because one of the criticisms that I have of Maduro is that he hasn't been bold enough. And I understand why. There are some people who support Maduro, economists like Mark Weisbrot, for instance, who I respect very much, but who advocate just eliminating all the controls, eliminating or practically eliminating the price controls and the exchange controls, which I myself don't favor. I think that controls are justifiable, but when they get out of hand, they're a recipe for serious problems. And so you have the exchange controls in which, under Chavez, the disparity between the official exchange control, which is 4.3 bolivares to the dollar, and the unofficial black market rate, which fluctuated between 8 and 9 bolivares, that was manageable. But after Chavez left to Cuba, and there was kind of like a power vacuum in Venezuela, Maduro was the acting president, but until he was elected president in April of the following year, that situation got out of control. And the black market rate, I remember in late 2012, skyrocketed. Once Maduro became, official president, elected president, it wasn't that easy to reestablish the old system of maintaining some kind of relationship between the official rate and the black market. Now, I've been critical of Maduro because I don't see him taking bold moves. I don't agree with those who say it's a cinch, it's a pushover, just decree, eliminate the change. That's what the opposition calls for. Jose Guerra, who's the leading economist of the opposition, a national deputy, he makes it seem as if all you got to do is, decree it, and it's going to be, everything's going to be hunky-dory. I don't agree with that. But I think you've got to make these difficult decisions, and I don't see Maduro acting. Just to give you one example, he stated a couple of years ago that he was going to increase the price of gasoline. Gasoline in Venezuela is virtually free. I mean, it's very, very, very cheap. And he announced that he was going to increase it. Everybody, not everybody, a lot of people would like it to remain cheap. But most people that I know said, that's necessary. He said he was going to put that into effect at the right moment. And everybody thought that was going to be a couple of weeks. Well, he waited almost a year to put that into effect, and it was really meaningless because with an inflationary situation, any increase is going to be wiped out by inflation in a couple of months. So these measures that he announced recently, I think, are important measures with regard to gasoline, in terms of people being subsidized in order to minimize the side effect, but international prices for gasoline. So I think that is an interesting. And the other measure of allowing people to sell and buy dollars or any currency on the open market through this system of auctions, which means that you have a supply and demand. People offer dollars, people offer bolivares, and they come together. That also is a bold move. So I think it's too early to really know whether they're able to get inflation under control that way. I know the price of the dollar at these auctions have not increased substantially. So that's an encouraging sign, but not enough dollars are getting sold. I mean, people need dollars, the importers need dollars, so you want dollars for the importers, you don't want to provide dollars for the speculators. So it's not an easy situation. But I think it's encouraging that at least that has been decreed. And one last point about corruption. I have to say that the Maduro government has moved against corruption. The Attorney General, who was governor of my state, Tarek William Saab, was appointed Attorney General by the Constituent Assembly. Obviously, he has the blessing of Maduro, and he's moved. He's jailed 20 top executives in PDVSA, the state oil company. And he's moved against, in fact, it just came out that the ex-governor, Chavista, ex-governor of Cojedes, was jailed because of corruption. So that's been done. But on the other hand, these moves have come from above. And a criticism that I have is that you don't have a situation in which people can denounce corruption. There's no mechanism. And you hear from Chavez people saying, rank and file of Chavez people, or activists saying, if I see corruption, I don't have any place to go. And I'm a Chavista, why can't I have the party or some mechanism in which I can report this kind of thing? So that's the shortcoming and that's the downside.
So we have time for just one more question, and I think we have a request here. And we can take some more in a more informal context in the last few minutes after
this question if you still have something that you want to ask.
Yes, go ahead.
Profesor, discúlpeme, lo voy a hacer en inglés y si usted me puede traducir. No, en español. Sí. Estamos hablando de sanciones y no hemos ido más hacia el tema político o económico, ¿no? Pero me gustaría que usted hablara del efecto emocional que tienen esas sanciones donde siempre está implícita la posible intervención o, por ejemplo, la condena de Venezuela en el tema de derechos humanos. Y también me gustaría que usted se refiriera al tema, ¿cuál es su opinión sobre la moral internacional que se observa cuando países, por ejemplo como el gobierno colombiano, con más de 86.000 desaparecidos, el gobierno mexicano con más de 50.000 y quizás mucho más, los procesos de desinceración de las dictaduras de Argentina, que no han explicado sus 30.000 muertos, mismo Chile que no ha conseguido explicar los 3.000 muertos, o Brasil, del cual soy un testigo muy cercano y me gustaría tener la oportunidad de citar cómo era esa dictadura, ¿no? ¿Cómo es posible que estos países sean precisamente los que se van a La Haya a querer condenar a Venezuela o a acusarla por violación de los derechos humanos cuando Venezuela es un país que no tiene un solo desaparecido político señalado? O no tiene ningún periodista cuando América Latina en su totalidad tiene 429 periodistas muertos por razones políticas en los últimos 12 años. Venezuela no tiene ninguno. Tiene 2 y eran oficialistas. Eso me gustaría que usted comentara sobre eso, ¿no?
Okay, a number of questions. One is with regard to the emotional aspect of the sanctions. You know, I've talked about the political aspect and the economic aspect. I haven't talked about the emotional aspect. And yeah, it is no question about it that people are really afraid of the U.S. invasion of Venezuela. I personally believe that anything's possible, at least during the presidency of President Trump. You know, he's unpredictable. But I don't see that as the most likely, you know, political scientists talk about most likely scenario, least likely scenario. I don't see it as the most likely scenario. But I can tell you from living in Venezuela that people really fear the possibility of an invasion. And I think that that is part of the strategy of the Trump administration. When Trump talks about the military option, he says that the military option is on the table, and he talks about the possibility of a military coup. I think that that is designed to encourage military officers to turn against Maduro. Because if there is military intervention, they're the ones, I mean, everybody's life will be endangered, but especially military, people in the military. And so this is a way of pressuring them and their families, their wives, their families, who pressure them into moving against Maduro in order to avoid a situation in which their lives will be on the line. So there's no question that what you said about the emotional part of the story is extremely important. With regard to derechos humanos in other countries, yeah, the issue, the emotional aspect of the issue of human rights is extremely important, and it's extremely important on all sides of the political spectrum. Let me just tell you something about the people on the right, the people who supported the demonstrations. These demonstrations in 2017, the leaders stated, we're gonna overthrow, we're gonna oust Maduro because he's illegitimate, and the whole system is illegitimate. We can't trust the electoral council, we can't trust anything about the government, anything about the political system. When the Constituent Assembly announced that elections would be held on October 15th, this is 2017, this is last year, in the first days of August, those protests ended. Because the political parties, all the political parties, with the exception of Maria Corina Machado, whose name I just mentioned, they all wanted to participate in elections. They wanted to get their people elected into office. They were gubernatorial elections. They wanted their people elected as governor. And so the young people who participated in elections, and a lot of people who supported the young people, became very disenchanted with the opposition because they said, you know, people have been killed on these demonstrations, and they've been killed because we believed that the system was illegitimate. Now, these parties are participating in the system. You don't participate in elections if you believe that the arbitrator, the arbitration or the electoral system is illegitimate and there'll be electoral, nobody participates in an election of that sort. So there is an emotional content, and it affects people across the political spectrum. And then finally, the statement about the countries who are calling on measures against Venezuela and their human rights record. But there's no question about it. Colombia, which has a terrible human rights record with regard to the killings of human rights activists and trade unionists. I was invited to a conference in Great Britain, London, a long time ago, on Venezuela. And we met with, I spoke with, at the podium with trade union leaders. And the trade union leaders, all they talked about was Colombia. They said that out of 5 trade union leaders who have been assassinated throughout the world, 4 are Colombian, on a yearly basis, you know? 4 out of 5 are Colombians. And you also mentioned the case of Mexico, the journalists, with the 43 students in Iguala who disappeared. And in the case of Venezuela, you don't have cases of people who have been disappeared by anybody. So that's true. It's just such an obvious, blatant contradiction.